Michael had seen many strange things in his life, but nothing prepared him for what he walked into that evening. The house was too quiet. No laughter, no footsteps, no sound of his triplets. He followed a faint voice to the last room and stopped. His three sons, Daniel, David, and Ethan, were on their knees beside the maid, Cynthia. Their small hands were clasped, eyes closed, whispering prayers. In the home of a man who didn't believe in God, someone was praying. He stood frozen, watching. The woman he paid to clean was teaching his children to believe in something he swore wasn't real. He wanted to stop her, but the peace on their faces made him weak. For years, his house was filled with silence, but now it felt alive. And as Cynthia's soft voice thanked God for kindness, the billionaire who believed in nothing felt something break inside him, something that had been gone since his wife died. They be any fivers of the side stead. The house had never been this still. No footsteps, no laughter, no sound of the boys fighting over toys or shouting at the television. Michael opened the front door quietly, his coat still on, his briefcase in one hand. He looked around the wide marble hallway. The lights were on, the toys were stacked neatly in a corner, and everything smelled faintly of soap. Something about it felt strange, almost lifeless. He loosened his tie, listening. There was no sound of cartoons from the living room, no noise from the kitchen, not even the soft thud of running feet. He frowned, calling out softly, "Daniel, David, Ethan." No answer. He tried again, louder this time, his voice echoing through the empty space. Nothing. He dropped his briefcase by the door and walked deeper into the house. Michael wasn't a man who liked surprises. He built his life around control. Every second of his day was planned. Every person in his world knew when to speak and when to leave. He didn't believe in chance or fate, and he certainly didn't believe in prayer. After his wife died, he told himself that everything people said about heaven was just to make loss feel lighter. He didn't want comfort. He wanted proof, and there was none. As he moved through the quiet rooms, his heart felt uneasy, though he didn't want to admit it. He checked the living room, the kitchen, even the garden. Everything was spotless. The boys' shoes were neatly lined up near the stairs. Their toys were packed in boxes. The calm felt wrong. He was used to chaos. The triplets were always loud, always moving. For them to be this quiet, something had to be different. Then he heard it. A faint sound, like a whisper, coming from down the hallway. It wasn't music or television. It was a voice, soft and steady. He followed it carefully until he reached the last door. He pushed it open a little, and what he saw stopped him completely. There, in the middle of the room, his three sons were kneeling. Daniel, the oldest by 2 minutes, had his hands clasped tightly. David had his head bowed, and Ethan, the smallest, was holding the maid's hand. Beside them, Cynthia knelt on the rug, her eyes closed, whispering softly, "Thank you, God, for keeping us safe, and for helping us be kind today." For a moment, Michael thought he was imagining it. His sons, praying. The word itself made him uneasy. It belonged to his late wife, not to him. She had been the believer, not him. She used to pray every morning at the edge of their bed, whispering about strength and peace. When she died, he buried that part of life with her. Now here was this woman, the maid he barely spoke to, sitting in his home teaching his children to believe in what he called foolishness. He wanted to speak, to stop her, but something held him still. Maybe it was the quiet in the room, or the way his sons looked peaceful for the first time in years. He had seen them cry, fight, and break things, but never this calm. Cynthia's voice stayed low, her words slow and warm. She didn't seem to notice him standing there. "Even when we feel alone," she whispered, "God still hears us." Daniel opened his eyes for a moment, looked at her, and smiled faintly. It wasn't the kind of smile Michael was used to seeing. It was softer, lighter, almost free. Michael felt a sharp ache in his chest. He didn't move. His throat felt tight, his fingers trembling slightly. He didn't like what he was feeling, because it wasn't anger. It was something deeper. Something he couldn't explain. He took a small step back and leaned against the wall, still watching. The boys' voices joined hers now, uneven but sincere. "Thank you, God," Ethan said in a whisper, "for helping me not be scared at night." David's small voice followed. "Thank you, for the nice lady who reads to us." Cynthia smiled gently without opening her eyes. Michael closed his own eyes for a second. He could still remember when his wife used to read bedtime stories to the boys, the soft hum of her voice filling the house. That memory had faded slowly after her death. For years, he had replaced warmth with wealth, love with logic, and family time with business meetings. He told himself he was doing it for them, but he knew deep down he was just running from the pain. Now, seeing them like this, he realized something had changed in his absence. This woman had brought something into his home that he couldn't control, and yet he couldn't deny the peace it carried. Cynthia finally ended the prayer, whispering, "Amen." The boys repeated it softly. Then she opened her eyes, her expression calm and kind. "All right," she said with a smile. "Time for bed." They stood up slowly, yawning. Ethan leaned into her arm and whispered something he couldn't hear. She nodded, rubbing his back gently, and tucked the blanket around his shoulders. Michael stepped away before she noticed him. He walked down the hall, back into the silent living room. He sat on the couch, his hands clasped tightly together. He didn't know what to feel. Anger? Confusion? Relief? He had spent years keeping faith out of his house. Now, it had walked back in through the maid's quiet words. He looked around the house again, but this time, it didn't feel empty. The silence had changed. It wasn't the kind that hurt. It was calm. He sat there for a long time, listening to the faint sound of Cynthia's voice down the hall as she hummed a lullaby. When she finally walked out, she didn't see him. She moved carefully, picking up toys, folding small shirts, adjusting the curtains. Every small act carried care. It wasn't part of her job. It was something else, something his money could never buy. He watched her for a moment longer, then turned his head away. He didn't believe in miracles, but tonight, something had started that logic couldn't explain. He didn't sleep that night. He just sat there, staring at the family photo on the shelf. His wife was smiling in that picture, holding the boys when they were toddlers. He touched the frame softly and whispered, "I don't know what's happening, Emma, but something is changing." Upstairs, Cynthia checked on the boys one last time. They were sleeping quietly, their faces calm. She stood by the doorway for a few seconds, her eyes warm and gentle. "Thank you," she whispered softly, "for letting me stay." And in another part of the house, the billionaire who didn't believe in God closed his eyes for the first time in years, not in prayer, but in silence that finally felt peaceful. The next morning came quiet, covered in soft sunlight that poured through the tall glass windows of the mansion. Michael had barely slept, but he didn't feel tired. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. The image of his sons kneeling beside Cynthia kept replaying in his mind. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter, that it was just a maid overstepping her place, but deep down he knew it was more than that. He stood and walked toward the mirror. The man looking back at him didn't look like the billionaire people feared in meetings. His eyes looked tired, his face harder than he remembered. He loosened his shirt collar, trying to breathe. "You're losing control," he whispered to himself. "She's changing things." Downstairs, the house smelled like pancakes. He heard soft laughter from the kitchen, something he hadn't heard in a long time. He followed the sound and stopped at the doorway. Cynthia was at the stove, flipping pancakes, while the boys sat at the table, talking over each other. Daniel was pouring syrup and making a mess, David was telling a story, and Ethan was clapping and laughing at something small. The sight made Michael freeze. Cynthia looked up and gasped softly. "Oh, good morning, sir," she said quickly, wiping her hands on her apron. "I didn't know you were home." He stepped in slowly. "I came home last night," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "It seems a lot happens when I'm not here." The boys looked at him, their laughter fading a little. David spoke first, his voice soft. "Daddy, Cynthia made pancakes for everyone." Michael nodded, his eyes on the table. "I can see that." He sat down at the head of the table, trying to act calm, but inside his mind was a storm. He picked up his fork, cut a small piece, and ate. It tasted good, too good. He wasn't used to food made with care. Ethan slid a small plate toward him. "She made yours with bananas," he said shyly. "She said it helps when people don't sleep well." Michael's hand froze midair. How did she know he hadn't slept? He looked at her, and Cynthia smiled lightly. "I heard you walking around last night, sir," she said softly. "I figured you needed something warm this morning." He wanted to say something sharp, something to remind her she was just an employee, but the words didn't come. Instead, he said, "Thank you." It came out quieter than he expected. Breakfast ended slowly. The boys left for school with their driver, still laughing, waving goodbye to Cynthia from the car window. When the sound of the engine faded, silence filled the room again. She began clearing the plates, but Michael stopped her. "Sit," he said quietly. She looked unsure, but obeyed. He folded his hands on the table. "I want to know what happened last night," he said. "Why were my sons praying?" Cynthia met his eyes carefully. "Because they wanted to, sir." "I didn't ask them to," he replied. "And I didn't hire you to teach them religion." Her tone stayed gentle. "No, sir. You hired me to care for them, and sometimes caring means listening when they're hurting." Michael leaned back, his voice low. "They're children. They'll forget." She shook her head slowly. "They don't forget pain, sir. They just hide it." The words hit him harder than he wanted to admit. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the garden. For years, he had avoided this part of parenting. He thought the best thing he could do for his children was to give them everything money could buy: tutors, doctors, gadgets. But all those things had done nothing. Cynthia's voice broke the silence. "They miss their mother every day. They talk about her sometimes when they think no one is listening." He turned. "What do they say?" "They ask if she can still see them," she said softly. "If she knows when they're sad. I don't have answers, so I just tell them she'd be proud of how strong they are." Michael looked down at the floor. "You shouldn't tell them things like that." "Why not?" she asked gently. "Because it gives them false hope." She smiled faintly. "Hope isn't false, sir. It's just quiet." He didn't reply. He stood there for a long moment, then finally said, "I don't believe in the things you talk about." "I know," she said calmly, "but they do." Her words stayed with him even after she left to do laundry. The house felt different now, as if something warm had entered through an open window. He went into his office, but the numbers on his screen didn't hold his mind. All he could think about was how peaceful his sons looked when they prayed. Later that evening, the boys came home from school. Michael was still in the living room, pretending to read the newspaper. Daniel ran up to him first. "Dad, Cynthia helped me finish my drawing today." David joined in. "She said we can plant something on the balcony this weekend." Michael frowned. "Plant?" Ethan nodded. 3 small trees, one for each of us. She said it will help us remember to take care of what we love." He looked at their faces, bright and eager. He wanted to stop them, to say no, but something inside him softened. "All right," he said finally. "You can plant them." That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Michael walked quietly toward their room. The door was half open. Cynthia was sitting on the edge of Ethan's bed, humming softly, tucking in the blanket. Her voice was low, calm, like a whisper of comfort. When she turned and saw him standing there, she froze. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quickly, standing up. He shook his head slowly. "It's fine," he said quietly. "I was just checking on them." She nodded. They had a good day. He looked at the sleeping boys and then back at her. "You're good with them," he said quietly. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "They just need someone who listens." He wanted to ask her something, maybe how she managed to reach them when he couldn't, but the words stayed trapped in his throat. Instead, he said softly, "Good night." "Good night, sir." He walked back to his room, but sleep didn't come. He sat on his bed, staring at the dark ceiling. Something about her voice, the peace in his son's faces, the strange calm in the house, it all unsettled him. He wasn't ready to believe in what she believed, but for the first time in years, he wanted to understand it. And somewhere deep inside, he felt it the beginning of something he could not name, something that scared him more than he wanted to admit. 2 weeks passed, and the house was no longer the same. Laughter started to fill the halls again. The boys woke up early, running to the kitchen before Cynthia even finished setting the table. They talked louder, smiled easier, and fought less. The silence that used to hang over the mansion had been replaced by small sounds of life, the kind that made a house feel like home. Michael noticed it, even if he didn't say it out loud. He sat in his office every morning, pretending to focus on his work, but he found himself listening to their voices through the walls. The sound of Daniel reading his book out loud, David asking questions about the world, Ethan laughing when Cynthia told him something funny. For the first time in years, the house didn't sound empty. One afternoon, Michael returned from a business meeting earlier than usual. As he stepped into the living room, he froze. Cynthia was on the balcony with the boys, kneeling beside 3 small pots filled with soil. The triplets were laughing, their hands messy with dirt. "Remember what I said?" Cynthia told them softly. "Things don't grow just because we want them to. They grow because we show up and take care of them every day." Ethan tilted his head. "Like people?" She smiled. "Yes, just like people." Daniel nodded proudly. "Then we'll water them every day." Michael stood quietly by the door, listening. The warmth in her voice, the peace in their laughter, it made something inside him ache. His wife used to speak that way, calm and full of patience. He remembered how she would hold his hand and say, "Love takes time, Michael. You can't rush hearts." He turned away before they noticed him. For a man who never believed in faith, this kind of peace felt strange. It didn't make sense, but it was real. That night, he sat by his bedroom window and watched the stars. He didn't pray, but he whispered into the quiet, "I hope I'm not too late." The next morning, Cynthia noticed him standing in the kitchen doorway while she packed the boys' lunches. "Good morning, sir," she said, smiling lightly. He nodded. "Morning." She hesitated for a second. "Would you like coffee?" "Yes," he said quickly. "Please." She poured it quietly and handed him the cup. Their eyes met briefly, and something about that moment felt different, soft, but unspoken. When the boys came running in, they were excited. "Dad, can you come to the school event today?" Daniel asked. "It's family day." Michael looked up. He hadn't been to one since his wife's funeral. He opened his mouth to refuse, but the look on their faces stopped him. "What time?" he asked. 3 o'clock, David said. "You'll come?" Michael nodded slowly. "I'll come." The boys cheered and hugged him before running off. Cynthia smiled quietly but said nothing. At 3, Michael stood at the back of the school hall, unsure of what to do. Parents were everywhere, laughing, taking pictures, cheering for their children. He wasn't used to being around ordinary families. He stood stiff, his hands in his pockets, watching from a distance. Then he saw them, his 3 boys on stage, smiling and waving. Cynthia stood beside them, guiding their steps, helping Ethan fix his collar. When the teacher asked if anyone wanted to share something about their family, Ethan stepped forward. "Our mommy is in heaven," he said softly, "and our daddy works a lot, but we have Cynthia, and she helps us not be sad anymore." The room went quiet. Michael's throat tightened. He looked around as people turned to see who the boys were pointing at. Cynthia's face turned red, her eyes watery. She looked at the boys, smiling gently, but she didn't say anything. Michael felt something heavy lift inside him. It wasn't shame. It was realization. For years, his sons had been hurting, and he didn't see it. But somehow, this woman, who had nothing, had given them everything they needed. After the event, he waited by the car while the boys hugged their friends goodbye. Cynthia walked up, her hands folded nervously. "I hope that wasn't out of place, sir," she said softly. "They just wanted to share." He looked at her for a moment. "You've done something here I couldn't," he said quietly. "You've given them peace." Her eyes lowered. "They're good boys, sir. They just needed to be seen." He nodded slowly. "And you? How did you learn to be like this?" She hesitated, then said softly, "I grew up in a home that didn't have much, but my mother used to say, 'Kindness is the one thing that doesn't cost a thing.' I try to keep that alive." For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the soft sound of the boys laughing behind them. Michael looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, he saw more than just an employee. He saw someone who had brought light into a home that had been dark for too long. That night, after dinner, the boys went to bed early. Michael sat in the living room, staring at the photo of his late wife again. "You'd like her," he whispered softly. "She reminds me of you." Cynthia came in quietly to pick up a few toys. "You should rest, sir," she said. He nodded. "I will." He paused. "Cynthia," he said gently, "thank you for what you're doing for them." She smiled faintly. "It's nothing, sir. They're easy to love." Her words lingered. When she left the room, he stayed there, thinking about them again and again. The next morning, his mother, Mrs. Howard, arrived unannounced. She was dressed sharply, her pearls glinting in the light. "Benjamin," she said firmly, "we need to talk." He sighed. "It's Michael, Mother. And what is it now?" She looked around the living room, her sharp eyes scanning everything. "I heard the maid has been taking liberties," she said coldly. "Teaching prayers, telling stories, changing routines. You can't allow that." Michael frowned. "She's been helping the boys heal." "She's overstepping," his mother snapped. "You don't mix faith with work. You pay her to clean, not to preach." Michael stood, his tone calm but strong. "She's done more for them than any tutor, doctor, or nanny ever did." His mother's voice dropped. "You're letting emotions cloud your judgment. She doesn't belong in this family." Michael looked at her carefully, his voice quiet. "She already is." His mother's eyes hardened. "Not for long." When she left, the house felt heavier. Michael stood by the window for a long time, his jaw tight. He didn't know what his mother was planning, but something in his gut told him it wouldn't be good. Upstairs, Cynthia was reading to the boys, unaware of what was coming. And for the first time in years, Michael felt afraid not of losing money or power, but of losing the only person who had made his home feel alive again. The next morning began quietly, too quietly. The boys woke up late, their laughter missing from the air. Michael came downstairs expecting to smell pancakes, but the kitchen was empty. The stove was cold, the counters clean, and Cynthia's apron hung neatly on the chair. Something felt wrong. He called out her name softly, then louder. "Cynthia." No answer. He searched each room, but she was nowhere. A folded note sat on the kitchen table. His hand shook slightly as he opened it. There were only 3 short lines written in her careful handwriting. I love them. I'm sorry. Don't stop helping them grow. His chest tightened as the words sank in. For a moment he couldn't move. Then he turned sharply, calling for the boys. Daniel came first, still in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. Dad, what's wrong? Michael didn't answer. He just handed him the note. David read it next, his lips trembling. Ethan stared at the paper, his small voice breaking. She promised she'd stay. No one spoke for a long time. Then Daniel's face twisted in anger. You made her leave, didn't you? Michael froze. What? Grandma was here yesterday, Daniel said. We heard her talking to her. David slammed his small fist on the table. You let her go like Mom. Ethan began to cry, clutching the note to his chest. Michael tried to reach for him, but Ethan pulled away. She said she wouldn't leave, he sobbed. Michael knelt down slowly. Listen to me, he said, his voice low and shaking. I didn't send her away, I swear I didn't. But his words didn't matter. To the boys, she was gone. He stood up and walked to his office. His mother's number was the first on his phone. She answered on the second ring. Good morning, Benjamin, she said, her voice smooth as ever. Mother, he said quietly, what did you do? There was a pause. Then she replied calmly, I did what you should have done. I asked her to leave before she destroyed the order in this home. His voice hardened. You paid her to leave? I offered her a choice, she said, unbothered. She took it. Michael's hand trembled around the phone. You don't understand, he said softly. She was healing this family. She's a maid, his mother snapped. Nothing more. For the first time, Michael raised his voice. She was everything this house needed. His mother went silent. He didn't wait for a reply. He hung up, grabbed his car keys, and headed for the door. The boys were still in the living room, their eyes red. Where are you going? Daniel asked quietly. To bring her home, Michael said. It took hours to trace her. The agency had one old address, a small town outside Georgia. He packed a small bag, told the boys to get in the car, and started the long drive. No one talked for miles. The sky turned gray, and rain began to fall softly against the windshield. David broke the silence first. Do you think she'll come back? Michael kept his eyes on the road. I don't know, son, but we'll ask her ourselves. They drove through the night, stopping only for gas and food. The boys took turns sleeping, their heads resting against each other. Michael kept driving. His mind ran through every moment the day he first met Cynthia. Her calm voice, her patience with his sons, her quiet strength. He realized how blind he'd been, how much he'd taken her for granted. By the time they reached Augusta, the rain had stopped. The streets were small, lined with porches and gardens. They found the house easily, a white cottage with blue shutters and a porch swing. An older woman opened the door, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. Can I help you? She asked kindly. Michael stepped forward. We're looking for Cynthia Thomas. The woman smiled softly. You must be the Howards. She talked about you. Is she here? Daniel asked quickly. The woman shook her head. No, honey. She's at the church. She goes there when she needs peace. Before Michael could speak, the boys were already running down the street toward the old chapel at the corner. He followed them, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. The church doors were slightly open. Light spilled through the windows, painting colors on the floor. Inside, Cynthia was kneeling at the front, her head bowed, hands clasped. Her lips moved silently in prayer. She didn't see them at first. But then, she heard her name. 3 small voices called out at once, full of tears and relief. Cynthia! She turned, her eyes wide, and before she could stand, the boys ran into her arms. Daniel, David, and Ethan clung to her tightly, crying and talking all at once. You left us, Ethan said through tears. You promised! Cynthia held them close, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I thought leaving was the right thing. I didn't want to make things harder. Michael stood at the back, frozen. His throat burned, his vision blurred. He took a slow step forward. It wasn't the right thing, he said softly. She looked up at him, her face wet with tears. I didn't want to cause trouble, she said. Your mother. He interrupted gently. She was wrong. He took another step closer. I was wrong too. The church was quiet except for the soft sound of the boys crying. Michael looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. I don't know what this is supposed to be, he said, his voice low. But I know this: we are not complete without you. Her lips trembled. Michael, I'm just the maid. He shook his head slowly. No, you're the reason this house feels like home again. You didn't just care for them, you cared for all of us. Behind them, footsteps echoed softly. His mother stood at the doorway, her face pale and tired. Michael, she said quietly. He turned, ready to argue, but her voice stopped him. I was wrong. Everyone froze. Mrs. Howard walked closer, her voice shaking. I thought I was protecting you. I thought people like her didn't belong in our world. But I was blind. She gave these boys something I couldn't. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small folded photograph. It was the boys on the balcony, smiling beside 3 small saplings. She handed it to Cynthia. They've grown, she said softly. Because of you. Cynthia looked at the picture, her eyes filling again. Daniel reached into his pocket and handed her something small, a crumpled drawing of the 4 of them standing under the same trees. We drew this for you, he said. She looked at the boys, then at Michael. Her voice was barely a whisper. Are you sure you want me back? Michael nodded slowly. Not as a maid, he said gently. As family. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, yes. The boys cheered and hugged her tighter. Even Mrs. Howard smiled faintly, wiping her eyes. For the first time in years, everyone in that family felt whole. Weeks passed. The saplings on the balcony grew taller, and the house was full of noise again. Laughter, music, the sound of life. Michael no longer hid behind his work. He learned to cook breakfast, to listen, to pray quietly when no one was watching. His mother visited often, no longer to judge, but to learn. And Cynthia, she no longer wore the maid's uniform. She was part of the family, sitting beside Michael at dinner, helping the boys with homework, teaching them that love is not bought, it's shown. On a quiet Sunday morning, the family gathered on the balcony, watering the small trees together. Daniel looked up and smiled. They're growing fast, he said. Cynthia nodded, her voice soft. That's what happens when you take care of what you love. Michael looked at her, then at the boys. For a man who once believed in nothing, he finally understood faith, not in miracles or money, but in people. And in that moment, standing under the morning light, he realized the truth he had searched for all his life. Some prayers don't need words, some are answered the moment you decide to stay. Dear viewers, this story reminds us that sometimes the most broken homes can be healed by the simplest acts of love. Michael had everything that money could buy, but it took a humble maid named Cynthia to teach him that peace doesn't come from wealth, it comes from presence. Her kindness, her patience, and her courage to stay turned pain into healing, and strangers into family. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who still believes love can change lives. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you learned from this story. If you'd love to see more powerful emotional stories like this one, comment more stories below and you'll be the first to get our next one. Before you go, answer these questions in the comments. 1. Do you believe love can change even the hardest hearts? 2. What was your favorite moment in this story? 3. If you were Cynthia, Would you have stayed or walked away? Your answers might inspire the next story we tell.